Welcome back to Storytime with Lara. We are reading Tiny Garden, Big Trouble, and I wrote this book in June, or published it in June 2016. It's about a couple of friends, Mary Martha Ann, and she's best friends with Rose. And they have nicknames, and you see Ben peeking out here. Ben is one of their best friends also, so there's 3 of them who hang out. We have read chapter 1 in a previous video, and today we're going to read chapter 2. This chapter is on page 3 if you're reading along, and it's called Love Thy Neighbor. It all started 1 week ago. Rose plopped down onto the red beanbag chair. It squeaked loudly, and some of the kids nearby giggled. Mrs. Reed, the 3rd grade teacher, smiled helplessly at Rose as she rang a small bell and said, "Okay, okay," and the class quieted down. Mrs. Reed spoke loudly. "Each group needs to come up and get the activity sheet. Group 1, you're first." She looked at Rose and motioned her forward. Rose's beanbag chair squeaked louder as she rolled out of it and onto the floor, her brown hair covering her face. The other students giggled and whispered. Her dark brown eyes focused on her best friend, Mary Martha Ann, who stood in line, smoothing her soft black hair off of her caramel brown face. Rose jumped up and put her hands out like it was a performance, just in time to see Mrs. Reed roll her eyes and shake her head. Rose's soft, dewy cheeks turned pink and then red. Mary Martha Ann was first in line, then Priscilla. Ben waved at Rose to get in line. Mrs. Reed smiled at Mary Martha Ann. Rose shrugged and got in line behind Ben. When they were returned to their groups, Rose motioned for Ben to sit in the beanbag chair. She sat on the floor beside Priscilla and waited for the loud squeak. She put her hand over her mouth so he couldn't see her, quietly giggling. Ben sat down in the beanbag chair without making a sound. Rose put her hands on her hips and frowned at him. "Oh, yeah, right," she said. Ben lifted his hands in defense. "What?" and smiled at her. Priscilla smoothed her dress, and Mary Martha Ann began reading the worksheet. "This says we are supposed to pick a buddy." She smiled at Rose, who replied with, "Done," and smiled back. They always like picking each other, I think. Ben looked shyly at Priscilla, who did not seem to be listening, and he nudged her. "That leaves us to be buddies." She looked up and said, "Yeah, okay." Mrs. Reed shifted from one foot to the other. "Okay, everyone." Her voice became louder as she sternly said, "Everyone, quiet down." The class became quiet as everyone turned to look at Mrs. Reed. "Let's go over this assignment together," she said. "The lesson last week taught us that the greatest commands are to love God and to love our neighbors. We will be working on a project called Loving Your Neighbor next week. This week we will get ready for the project by brainstorming ideas. You will be doing this in pairs. When we work in pairs, we have someone who encourages us and keeps us accountable." Now, does anyone remember what accountable means? Priscilla was twirling her strawberry blonde hair around her finger and then raised her hand. Mary Martha Ann sighed. Priscilla got called on a lot. Mrs. Reed waited and looked around the classroom for a moment. The students looked down or away from Mrs. Reed, hoping they wouldn't be called on. Priscilla continued to raise her hand. "Priscilla, can you tell us what accountability means?" Rose rolled her eyes and gave a knowing glance to Mary Martha. The class listened to Priscilla while Ben poked Rose in the ribs with his foot. She whispered, "Knock it off, Ben." He giggled, and the rest of the class giggled. Mrs. Reed shook her head. "Rose, maybe you should move away from Ben. Both of you need to be respectful of Priscilla. Go on, Priscilla." Priscilla glared at Rose and said, "As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, it means that we should work at being responsible with another person." Mrs. Reed nodded and said, "Very good. Now, let's pick buddies and start brainstorming. Please come up with a list of several ways in which you could love your neighbor, and then we'll discuss this next week. Now remember, these are only ideas. Do not jump ahead in this assignment. Ideas only. You will need your parents' permission and their help to complete the assignment in a couple of weeks." She continued, "For now, write up your ideas, draw a picture, be creative and thoughtful. We'll share ideas in groups next week." Mary Martha Ann scooted next to Rose and handed her the worksheet and a pencil. Rose wrote their names at the top. Then she whispered, "Priscilla's the teacher's pet." Mary Martha Ann whispered back, "Don't worry. Priscilla's just being snobby. Just forget about it. Want to come over after school to work on this?" Rose hated homework, but she loved hanging out with her best friend. "Of course, I'll come over after I check on my grandma. She likes it when I stop by and tell her about my day." That's the end of chapter 2. It ends on page 9, and chapter 3 starts on page 11. Super secret names. We'll go ahead and read chapter 3. Later in the afternoon sun, Mary Martha Ann and Rose sat under the mulberry tree eating apple slices and peanut butter. "Do you want to get our homework done?" asked Rose. No, but I also don't want to turn it in blank either," replied Mary Martha Ann. She smiled and started giggling. Rose had a mouthful of apple and smiled at her friend, showing the red apple peel, and then spit it out and giggled with her. Mary Martha Ann leaned back against the tree and laughed at the sight until Rose started to laugh, and then they laughed all over again. Mary Martha Ann's mom, Betsy, shouted, "Are you girls working on your homework? Because it doesn't sound like homework is getting done. Rose, if you need anything, let me know." Her mom was named Betsy, but everyone called her Mama B. "Okay, Mama B, I will. We are going to get started on homework right now," replied Rose. They looked at each other, then softly giggled and covered their mouths. When the laughter ended, they both lay on their backs in the spring grass and looked up the new fluffy clouds floating by. Mary Martha Ann spoke first. "You know what?" Rose shaded her eyes and looked over. "What?" "You are my best friend. Really, I'm so happy you are my best friend. You make me laugh every single day." "That's good to hear, because you are my best friend. We should always be best friends. When I get married, you can be my maid of honor, and you'll be like an auntie to all 12 of my children," said Rose. "Well, okay then, it's settled," Mary Martha Ann continued. "You will get married, and I will be your maid of honor and auntie to your 12 children. She thought of Rose with 12 children, and it made her smile. Rose sat up and looked at her friend. "Don't you want me to be the maid of honor and auntie to your children?" Mary Martha Ann murmured, "I don't know if I want to have children or get married." "But that's only because I'll have to help you take care of all of your children. If I get married, you can be my maid of honor. Okay?" "Okay, it's a deal," she said. "Hey, let's make up super secret names for each other," said Rose. "Well, now that's easy. Petals it is for you," said Mary Martha Ann. Rose asked, "Why Petals?" "Is it because I like to ride a bike?" She thought she was saying pedals, like riding the bicycle pedals. No, not petals. Petals. You know, like rose petals. You are like the wild roses that grow in the forest. So Petals is your super secret nickname," said Mary Martha Ann as she crossed her arms. "Okay, well then your super secret name is M, which is short for Emma." Mary Martha Ann smiled. "I always wished my mom would have named me Emma. How did you know that?" Rose laughed. "I remember you telling me that a long time ago. Best friends always remember the important things." Mary Martha Ann said, "I wish my mom would have picked either Mary or Martha, but not both, and then she also had to add Ann. Have you ever seen how long it takes me to write my name on all my assignments? Someday when I'm all grown up, I'll have people call me Ann or Annie, but M is great for a super secret name. Since you are my best friend, I'll call you whatever you like. M or Annie or both names are pretty, just like you." "Petals and M, best friends forever," said Mary Martha Ann. They both picked up the remains of their snacks and headed over to the picnic table in the front yard to work on homework. The screen door creaked and Mama B leaned out the door and said, "Girls, are you working on your homework? Rose, your mom called. You have to be home in time for dinner." The screen door creaked closed and slammed shut. M picked up the worksheet and handed it to Petals. "We can at least get started." Petals handed it back. "Sorry, Em, I have to get home. If Mom called, she's probably needing help." "But call me on the walkie tonight. We can work on it by flashlights," said Petals. Em replied, "Walkie-talkies and flashlights. The usual time?" "Yep. See ya, Em." "You too, Petals." And that's the end of chapter 3. In future videos, you'll get to hear the rest of the book, 1 or 2 chapters at a time. For now, we'll end here on page 16. I hope that you've enjoyed this reading of Tiny Garden, Big Trouble. If you want to get a copy of this book, you can find it as an ebook on Kindle, or you can find it as a paperback on Amazon. All right. Have a blessed day.